Okay, so you ready to dive in? We got a real hot topic this time. Appraisal bias.
Yeah, it's everywhere in the news these days, and for good reason, I think. It gets to the heart of fairness in housing, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
People want to know their homes are being valued fairly no matter what. And you sent us a ton of material on this, studies, the works. Seems like you're really trying to cut through the noise here,
Exactly. It's one thing to hear about it, it's another to actually dig in and try to understand what the evidence says.
which is what these deep dives are all about. So for this one, we're going to take a deep dive into these claims of appraisal bias, look at some real-world examples, like some of the cases you flagged in the articles you sent, and maybe even uncover why this has become such a big conversation right now. What do you think?
Sounds good to me. And hopefully, by the end of this, our listeners will have a more nuanced understanding of the issue and what it might mean for them.
Couldn't agree more. Now, you included a lot on the Abina Horton case from back in 2020 in Jacksonville. Seems like that one really sparked a lot of debate.
It did. That was the case in Florida where, as a reminder, a black homeowner claimed that her race was why her home was initially appraised for far less than it should have been.
Yeah, and the difference wasn't small either.
Yeah.
The initial appraisal came in at, what was it, $330,000?
Yeah.
But then, after she removed some personal items and had a white friend present for a second appraisal,
The value shot up to $465,000. Huge difference.
huge. And here's something I found really interesting. You mentioned that Miss Horton actually worked for a company that specialized in those automated valuation models.
Huh.
You know, the AVM.
Right. So she was familiar with how property valuations work, at least on some level.
Yeah, which makes you wonder. Although, you know what I found strange? None of the articles I read actually showed the full appraisal reports.
That's a good point. It's hard to evaluate those bias claims without all the details, isn't it? Like, what comparables did they use? What adjustments were made?
Exactly. And on top of that, she chose not to file a formal complaint with the Florida Board of Appraisers either. You know, if I truly believed I was discriminated against, I think that would be one of my first steps.
I can see why someone might see it that way, but, it's important to remember everyone reacts to situations differently.
It's tempting to see it that way.
Yeah.
But like a lot of these stories, there's a little bit more to it. Because a lot of the, especially early reporting on the Hortons case, didn't mention that Abina Horton was actually a vice president at Black Knight, which is a company that provides automated valuation models, AVMs.
So the person who's claiming this bias from a human appraiser actually works for a company that would kind of benefit if appraisers are seen as less reliable.
It's an interesting wrinkle, isn't it?
It is. I did not know that.
And it gets you thinking about, the motivations and, all the different incentives that are at play here.
Totally.
And speaking of motivations, another case that caught our eye was Cindy Chance. She's the former CEO of the Appraisal Institute.
Right.
She was very publicly pushing back against this narrative of widespread appraiser bias.
And then she was out.
Yeah, and it was very sudden, right?
Yeah, she was fired, wasn't she?
It was very abrupt. There was no explanation given.
Wow.
This was after, she had raised concerns about transparency and accountability within kind of the industry itself, and even questioned, the motives of the people who were pushing that, appraiser bias narrative so aggressively.
So, it does make you wonder then, who benefits from making appraisers the villains in this whole story?
Right.
But I guess before we get into that, I do want to look at some of the research that's being used to support, these claims of kind of systemic bias in appraisals.
Yeah, true enough. So moving on, I noticed that a lot of these articles go beyond this one case. They also discuss the broader issue of systemic racism and how that can impact property values, especially in predominantly minority neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that historical context because it absolutely plays a role. We're talking about redlining, discriminatory housing policies, lack of investment in certain communities. All of these have contributed to lower property values in many areas.
You can't just erase that history.
Right, exactly. But at the same time, I think it's also crucial to distinguish between those historical forces and, individual bias from an appraiser today. Those are two separate, though related issues.
Okay, that's an important distinction. And maybe this is a good time to do a little explainer for our listeners who might not be real estate experts. So how do appraisers actually determine a home's value? And where do these ethical guidelines come in?
Great question. So appraisers are bound by a strict code of ethics called Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. Basically, it means they have to use objective criteria to determine market value. Things like recent sales of comparable properties, the overall health of the market, the condition of the property itself, that sort of thing.
So no inflating or deflating values based on, say, who lives in the neighborhood or their personal feelings about a particular style of house.
Exactly. They can't let those factors influence their assessment. Their job is to figure out what the market says that property is worth based on objective data.
And some of these articles brought up a really interesting point. They question whether some groups actually benefit from making appraisers the scapegoats when these valuation discrepancies happen. What are your thoughts on that?
It's definitely something to consider. Think about who has a stake in this. We're talking lenders, those companies providing AVM services, even some government agencies.
And remember how we said Miss Horton worked for a company doing ADMs?
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. You included data from Redfin and Black Knight in the materials you sent, and neither of their AVMs at the time actually supported that higher appraisal value in the Horton case. Does that surprise you?
Not entirely. Look, AVMs are often presented as totally objective, right? Because they use algorithms and data. But here's the catch. Those algorithms and that data, they are based on historical information, which might already be skewed.
It's like if you tried to bake a cake but used, like, sour milk or something.
Exactly. No matter how good your recipe is, the result isn't going to be what you want. So if an AVM is using data that reflects decades of, say, lower property values in predominantly minority neighborhoods because of things like redlining, then it's probably going to generate valuations that keep those patterns going.
And that's how these biases get built into the system, even when we think we're making things more objective.
Okay, that's pretty mind-boggling when you really think about it. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is. And this is why we need to be careful about assuming that any technology is free from the biases that exist in the real world. After all, it's still humans who are creating those algorithms and feeding the system that data.
That is a great point. Now, to be fair, these articles did acknowledge that there have been legitimate cases of appraisal bias, but they also pointed out that the actual number is really small compared to how many appraisals are done every year. That's a really important detail, and you're right to bring it up because it's something that often gets lost in all the headlines and the social media discussions. None of those cases ever actually went to court. A lot of them ended up being settled out of court, which means there was no legal decision about whether or not there was actual discrimination.
Interesting. So even though there was no legal precedent set, the narrative was already starting to take hold. And this wasn't just happening in the U.S., right? I mean, there was that CBC News report from Canada where they sent homeowners of different races to the same house to get appraisals.
Oh, yeah, that one got a lot of attention, too. They found one house, I think it was, and they had a white homeowner, a South Asian homeowner, and a black homeowner, and each one interacted with a different appraiser. They were definitely trying to create a really strong narrative there to see if bias would show up.
And did it? Did their findings end up matching what they seemed to be going for? Did they find that the appraisals were consistently lower when a person of color was the homeowner?
Well, that's where things get kind of interesting. See, the report itself, it claimed that there was a big disparity in the valuations based on race. But if you actually dig into the data they presented, you start to see a bit of a different story.
Okay, so what did their data actually show?
Well, like, they said that the average appraisal for the black homeowner was the lowest. Right. But if you look at the actual numbers, that's just not true. One of the appraisers who saw the black homeowner actually ended up giving the highest valuation out of all of them.
So their narrative didn't really match up with their own data.
Yeah. And it gets even more interesting. When you average out all the appraisals for the minority homeowners and compare that to the average appraisal given to the white homeowner, the difference is less than 2%.
Wow. That's not nearly as dramatic a difference as a lot of people probably took away from that report. It definitely makes that whole idea of clear-cut, systematic discrimination a little more complicated, doesn't it?
It does. And it's extra striking when you compare it to the research done by Dr. Junia Howell. She was actually featured in that same CBC report. Her work shows a much wider disparity, something closer to 65% between neighborhoods where the residents are mostly white versus neighborhoods where the residents are mostly black.
65%. That is a huge difference. There's definitely a lot of data out there. But it doesn't always seem to tell a nice, neat, and tidy story, does it? I know you also included some reports in my research from the Brookings Institution. Where do those findings fit in with everything else we've been talking about?
Yeah, the Brookings Institution, they're kind of a big deal when it comes to housing research. And they've put out some reports that you see cited all over the place. One of the things that really jumped out at me was they're finding that homes in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black, they're often valued way lower than similar homes in mostly white neighborhoods. And we're talking about a pretty big difference here, right? I mean, their findings were definitely attention-grabbing. They concluded that homes in Black neighborhoods were being valued, on average, anywhere from 9% to 19% lower than comparable properties in white areas. Those kinds of discrepancies, they make you stop and think, for sure. But, and this is where things get really interesting, that same study, the one by Brookings, it actually attributes only a tiny sliver of that difference to actual appraisal bias.
Wait, seriously. So what do they say is causing that gap in values if it's not, biased appraisers intentionally lowballing things?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? What they point to is this whole bunch of different factors all swirling around together that contribute to those lower valuations. Like they talk about things like differences in things like the condition of the neighborhood, how easy is it to get to parks, libraries, good schools, stuff like that. And then you've got the overall trends in the local housing market, which can be all over the place. And even things like, say, the average age of the properties in the area or the size of the lots, all of that gets factored in. And what they're arguing is that all of those things together, they play a much more significant role in those differences in property values than any conscious bias on the part of the appraisers themselves.
So it's not as easy as just pointing a finger at appraisers and saying they're the problem. They're deliberately undervaluing these homes.
Right. So much more complicated than that. It's about understanding all the little intricacies of how these valuations actually happen, all the different things that go into it. It's not this simple equation with one clear-cut answer. But the thing is, these neighborhoods, they don't exist in a vacuum, right? There are all these bigger market forces at play. And every single neighborhood has its own, quirks, its own character, all these things that make it unique.
Yeah, and I think that's important to keep in mind. We can't let a handful of cases, even high-profile ones, make us think the whole system is broken. It's about nuance.
Right.
Totally. So if it's not always intentional bias, what are some other reasons we might see these appraisal discrepancies pop up?
Well, first of all, the market itself is constantly fluctuating. Prices go up, prices go down. It can be hard to pin down an exact value at any given moment. That's just the nature of real estate.
And sometimes it can feel like appraisers are looking into a crystal ball, right?
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that to it. And then you've got the condition of the property itself.
It all adds up.
And let's not forget about the experience and expertise of the appraiser themselves. Like in any profession, some people have more experience than others.
True. Someone just starting out might not have the same eye for detail as someone who's been doing it for 20 years.
Right. So, to answer your question, it's rarely just one factor in isolation that explains these discrepancies. It's usually a combination of things.
It's like trying to solve a mystery sometimes.
In a way, it is. You have to look at all the clues.
This is so interesting. Okay, so circling back to systemic racism for a second, you've included articles about.
They discuss how historically these practices actually resulted in lower property values in those neighborhoods. So it's not something we can just ignore.
It's important to keep that in mind, yeah. It's almost like we're trying to untie a really complicated knot, because while those historical factors are definitely real and have had a lasting impact, it doesn't automatically mean that every single case of a lower appraisal in these areas today is the result of a biased appraiser.
Absolutely not. I completely agree. It's about being able to hold both of those ideas in our heads at the same time. We can acknowledge the systemic issues without jumping to conclusions about individual appraisers' motivations. Remember, the data you sent suggests that most appraisers are following those ethical guidelines.
Right. Which leads us back to those AVMs, because there's been this big push to use them as like the solution to the problem. You take the human error out of the equation. But one article you sent argued that relying solely on AVMs could backfire and actually end up just perpetuating the biases that we're trying to get rid of in the first place.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
It's a really good point, and it's something to be very aware of. Because on the one hand, yes, in theory, AVMs should remove human bias. They rely on algorithms and data, not feelings and opinions. But, and this is a big but, those algorithms and that data, they're all built on historical information, which, as we know, could be skewed.
It's like trying to bake a cake with spoiled milk, right? Doesn't matter how great your oven is or how perfect your recipe is, the result is going to be off.
Perfect analogy, because if the AVM is being fed data that reflects decades of, let's say, lower property values in predominantly minority neighborhoods due to things like redlining, then guess what? It's probably going to spit out valuations that keep those patterns going.
So we think we're relying on a system to solve a problem, but in reality, that system might be infected with the same problem it's supposed to fix. This is honestly kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, and it really highlights why we need to be cautious about assuming that any technology is inherently neutral or bias-free. Because ultimately, it's still humans who are creating those algorithms and choosing what data to feed the system.
So are we just like doomed then? How do we make sure everyone gets a fair shot when it comes to their home's value, regardless of their race or background or anything else?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's something a lot of smart people are trying to figure out. I don't think there's a single easy answer, unfortunately, but the first step, I think, is awareness.
Awareness on everyone's part.
Absolutely. Homeowners, appraisers, lenders, real estate agents, everyone involved needs to be aware that bias, both the conscious kind and the unconscious kind, can creep into these valuations. And then we need to be much more proactive about addressing it, not just pretending it doesn't exist.
So this isn't just about pointing fingers. It's about recognizing that this is a shared responsibility to get it right.
Exactly. And a big part of that responsibility, I think, has to do with transparency. A lot of the experts you cited in your research mentioned the need for way more transparency in the process.
And I think it's also important to remember that, a lot of these high-profile bias cases that we hear about, you know, involved appraisals that were already really complex.
Oh, okay.
So we're talking about properties with very unique features. They might be in rapidly changing neighborhoods. Maybe there are very few comparable sales to base that appraisal on.
Okay, so it's just like a very difficult thing to assess, period.
Exactly.
Regardless of who you are, what your background is.
Exactly, yeah. Situations where determining that fair market value can be really challenging, even for the most experienced appraiser.
So sometimes, those differences that we're seeing, they might just come down to the complexities of the actual property itself, not some hidden bias.
Right.
Okay.
And I think we also have to talk about the role of appraisal management companies.
Oh, right.
AMCs.
Yeah, AMCs, yeah.
And they act as this kind of middleman between the lenders and the appraisers.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't always have the best reputation for prioritizing quality over cutting costs.
No, I've definitely heard horror stories about AMCs pushing appraisers to work super quickly and cheaply,
Right.
which doesn't exactly inspire a ton of confidence.
Exactly, because they're often incentivized to just choose the appraiser who's going to be the fastest and the cheapest.
Right.
Which often can mean, less experienced, less thorough. And this whole focus on efficiency over accuracy, I think, can really contribute to those inconsistencies that we see in appraisals.
Yeah.
Which then, gets sort of blamed on individual bias.
Right, because it's like the old adage, you get what you pay for.
Right.
And it sounds like if you're trying to rush this process to get it done very cheaply, that's how these problems arise.
Exactly. And then you layer on top of that the issue of what we call anchoring bias.
Anchoring bias.
Where if a second appraiser is brought in, they already know that the first appraisal was disputed.
Which could then totally influence
Exactly.
their assessment.
Yeah. They might feel this pressure, even subconsciously, to come in with a higher number.
They are kind of being subtly influenced by the circumstances.
This has been so helpful, honestly. We've really gone deep on this. From the specifics of appraisal bias to the potential pitfalls of relying solely on those AVMs. And we've talked about the importance of transparency and accountability within the appraisal industry. But I feel like there's still so much more to discuss. Now, we talked earlier about how lenders and real estate agents also have a responsibility here.
Yeah.
So what does that actually look like in practice? What can they be doing differently?
Well, for lenders, it starts with being much more discerning about the appraisal management companies they choose to work with. Are they prioritizing diversity within those companies? Do those companies have a solid track record of fair and unbiased valuations?
It's about holding those companies accountable as well, not just focusing on the individual appraisers.
Right. And real estate agents can play a key role in helping their clients prepare for the appraisal process in advance.
Like giving them the tools and the knowledge to advocate for themselves.
Exactly. And they can also be really instrumental in challenging appraisals that seem off base. They have the market expertise and knowledge of comparable sales to make a strong case for a different valuation.
So it really does take a village, doesn't it? We all have a part to play in making this system more fair and equitable.
It really does. And if there's one big takeaway from all this research, I think it's this. While technology like AVMs can be a useful tool, We can't just blindly rely on algorithms to solve these deeply human problems.
We can't just abdicate responsibility and hope the machines will figure it all out.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really important point that I think a lot of people miss. This makes you wonder, if algorithms are using data that could be biased, are we just, setting ourselves up for a future where those same inequalities are baked into the system permanently?
Yeah, it's like, are we just slapping a tech mirror on a very human problem?
Exactly. And it makes you question how we address systemic bias in all areas of life, not just real estate. But to bring it back to our topic for today, you did include some alternative ideas for how we can tackle this in the materials you sent.
Right, because we can't just throw up our hands and say it's too complicated to fix. So what were some of those suggestions?
Well, one that kept coming up was the need for greater diversity within the appraisal profession itself.
That makes sense. More voices at the table, right?
That's the idea. And finally, a lot of the experts you cited stressed the importance of ongoing education and training for everyone involved. Appraisers, lenders, real estate agents, even homeowners.
So we're all working from the same playbook? Wow, this has been a real eye-opener, I gotta say. We've gone from a single news story to this much bigger conversation about systemic bias, the limits of technology, and what real accountability could look like.
It's complex. There are no simple answers. But the key takeaway here is that we all have a role to play in making sure that homeownership is accessible and equitable.
And that starts with staying informed, asking tough questions, and refusing to just accept the status quo. If something doesn't feel right, speak up. Advocate for yourself, your community, for a fairer system all around.
I love that.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive. Thank you so much for guiding us through these thorny issues. And to all of you listening, we hope this conversation has given you a lot to consider. Remember, knowledge is power. And the more informed you are, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the world around you. Maybe even make a difference.